Hey y'all, I'm Lee from Americus, Georgia, and I support Adoptees On because it provides us with a safe, supportive community in which to connect and care for ourselves in a way many of us cannot experience elsewhere. Adoptees On allows us to be comrades in grief, celebration, and healing. I'm inviting you to join me in supporting this podcast so we can reach more adoptees around the world to know they aren't alone. Join me over at adopteeson.com/partner, where any level of contribution helps. Thank you.
You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is episode 191, Dr. Erin Heim. I'm your host, Haley Radke. We are kicking off a new series this fall on spirituality. And even as I say it, I get that little feeling in my stomach and I think, oh no, I want everyone to feel included. And I know it can be awkward talking about religious things, faith things, spiritual things, but I hope that you will trust me with these conversations. I think we can agree that adoption has been influenced by different religious groups. And I was going to say for better or worse, but for worse, I feel like. And in today's episode, we are going to look very critically at Christianity and the evangelical adoption machine. And if you're new here, I just want to say welcome. Thanks for listening. And most of my series kind of pop back and forth. So sometimes we have healing series episodes with therapists. We've had this estrangement series episode on and off for the last few months. And just like that, the spirituality series will kind of pop in and out of regular episodes. So let's get to it. Today's guest is Dr. Erin Heim, who has spent a decade of her life researching and examining both the biblical texts in the New Testament that mention adoption, as well as multiple books written from an evangelical perspective of adoption promotion. Erin teaches us what adoption looked like during biblical times, and spoiler alert, it's nothing like modern-day adoption. Erin and I also put a critical lens to how adoptees are treated in the church today, and how conflating biblical adoption and modern-day adoption is harmful and keeping churches from embracing a family preservation stance. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On Dr. Erin Heim. Welcome, Erin.
Thanks, Haley. It's good to be here.
I'm so glad to connect with you. We have a mutual friend, and she has always raved about you. And I read your work several years ago, this massive tome. You're rolling your eyes at me, but because it's academic, but I did read it, I promise, Adoption in Galatians and Romans. But before we get to that, I'd love it if you would share some of your story with us.
Sure, thanks. I'm rolling my eyes in part just because I can't believe that someone, reads someone else's PhD thesis. It's just such a specific thing that you end up writing. So this is my PhD thesis. So thank you for being like the one person who's read it. No,
there's got to be at least a dozen. Come on.
I mean, right? Yeah, like it's in the double digits now, maybe. Anyway, so yeah, thanks, and it's great to be here. So to share a little bit about my story, you can hear from the title of the book, Adoption in Galatians and Romans, that I wrote about adoption. But the reason that I got interested in writing about adoption in the New Testament is because I was adopted. And in so many ways, the journey to my PhD was a journey to figure out what that meant. Not that I think my PhD really helped do that in the end, but I learned some things, I think, along the way. So I was adopted in 1983, so kind of at the end of the baby scoop era in the U.S., and I was adopted as an infant, closed adoption. I have notes from my first 7 weeks of life when I was in foster care that are kind of strange to read now because, yeah, they say things like baby likes this and baby is sleeping through the night and baby doesn't like this much formula. And it's just odd to hear yourself referred to in those ways. And then I was adopted I was placed with my parents at 7 weeks old on August 9th. And I've had, a stable home there for I always say that my adoption it's an adoption story that has gone largely right. I had a happy childhood. I was an only child. My parents adopted me through Catholic Charities, and they did so because they couldn't have biological children. So I was a wanted child in that regard. And I went through, I think, the normal pains of being an adoptee during your teenage years, pretty significant identity crisis, pretty significant bout of depression in my teenage years. And that kind of set me on this path of discovery, which in many ways has been a path of faith for me. So I grew up Catholic, not necessarily a devout Catholic, and then became like a very devout Christian as a teenager, and that conversion has stuck for me. And then I have a music degree as my undergraduate degree, and my parents were very supportive of that, even though I am the only person in my family who's musical. And then decided to go to seminary and did my seminary degree because I got married in my undergraduate degree to a very nice guy. And I was intending to be a pastor's wife, which is a little bit funny to think about now. And I was for a while. I was a pastor's wife because he has an MDiv and he pastored. And I got an MA in New Testament because I like Greek and I like being in university settings. And then I did my PhD and I settled on my topic of adoption, really to think like, what does it mean when, the Apostle Paul says that we've received a spirit of adoption? And what does it mean to say that we're, in some ways, in Romans 8, Paul uses the language of groaning in the earth is, groaning in the pains of childbirth. And we are groaning in pains of, groaning and because we're awaiting our adoption, the redemption of our bodies. And I puzzled over that as an adoptee, thinking, what does this experience of adoption have to do with my adoption, if anything? And that set me down my PhD research. So and that was in 2011. So that's been 10 years that I've been kind of wrestling with this question. And I think the more that I wrestle, the more that I actually am pretty convinced that when the New Testament uses the language of adoption, it actually doesn't have very much to do with what we would think about as adoption. And I'm not actually convinced that it's very helpful to talk about them in the same breath. But nevertheless, it's taught me some important things, or I've had to do some soul searching and I've learned some important things about my own identity as an adoptee, kind of in light of my research, even though I don't necessarily think they're related anymore. So that's the short version. Lots to unpack.
Thank you for sharing that. There is so much to unpack. I am so excited to unpack this with you because, I come from a Christian background as well. And there is so much of modern day adoption practices intermingled with the evangelical church. And you mentioned those couple of verses. How many times have you heard that at church? And we got to save those orphans on Orphan Sunday. And it makes me so uncomfortable to see how that's all been wrapped up. And when I said I read your book a few years ago, I was really in this place of just desperately trying to understand, what did adoption even mean back then? Like, I don't think it was, what modern day adoption is. So would you mind sharing a little bit about that? Because I know you know exactly what it meant.
Yeah, thanks. And I hope this is about to be very technical and maybe a little bit nerdy, which gives you an insight into just like my everyday life.
Academia, we're here for it, Erin. We're here.
Yeah. So basically, I study the period that are surrounding the New Testament. So that means like the 1st century CE and maybe, the 1st century BCE and maybe the 2nd century. And basically what it means is that like a lot of my PhD research was looking into how families were formed in Greek and Roman culture in a way that like replaced the fate of, or the chance that, birth and childbirth and infant mortality and child mortality, like all of those things. Like, what do you do as a family if you don't have an heir left at the end of your life, or if you have an heir that's not suitable, or if you have a second son that you need to give away? Like, what do you do? And the answer to that question is you give your son, your adult son, in adoption so he can be some other family's heir, or you take a son from another family and you make that person your heir. And usually it's a close family member, but significantly, this is not like when Paul uses that language in the New Testament, he's not talking about children, not talking about vulnerable children. He's talking about the privileges that come from being an adult male heir adopted by another adult male who is a father figure. And so it's hard to even think like how that would happen. But basically it's like naming, if there's a modern equivalent, it'd be like naming a benefactor in your will and saying, this person is my son. They're going to inherit my whole estate and be in charge of my family, my property, any assets that I have. That all passes to this person. Oh, and by the way, he's going to carry on my family religious obligations to my family cult. Like that's what adoption does in the ancient world. So its purpose is different. The bonds are have some striking similarities to how we think about adoption. So like an adopted son is, the same in terms of the eyes of the law as a natural son. Oddly, your women don't adopt. So like your adoptive father is your adoptive father, but the mother of the family is not your adoptive mother. Like you'd still probably talk about your mother from your family of birth, family of origin as your mother. But you then, like all of the sibling relationships, those would all fall into place in your adopted family. So they would be your siblings, but women are like excluded from this. The other thing is women weren't adopted because women can't inherit. Well, they can inherit, but they can't possess power of the father. Like they can't be in charge of a family. So you wouldn't want them as your heir because they're not ever going to occupy that position. So that's what adoption means in the first century. Paul's using that language to say something about inheritance, to say something about kind of the age to come in eschatology, but he's not saying something about vulnerable children necessarily. And I think that's a big difference. Hopefully that's a good crash course.
I totally think it is. So I wrote a couple notes down that you're passing on inheritance, status, wealth, title, religion. You mentioned the cult. So can you just explain what that is for the time?
That's a good academic term. Cult is the word that we use for like any religious practice. So in the ancient world, most Roman families would have like household gods, and you would be in charge of like maintaining your family's devotion to your household gods. So like any of your ancestors, any of the family, like it's not ancestor worship, but it's kind of, it's got some similarities to that.
Adjacent. So, So you needed someone to carry that on as well.
Yeah.
Now, the other interesting thing that I remember you writing about is that the adopted person still kept their original identity as well. Because we're talking about an adult male.
Yep.
And they still had that. Can you talk about that?
And we know that from inscriptions, because when an adopted person was adopted, it was not like a big secret. It was not a shameful thing. In fact, it was something to be celebrated. So in the first century, emperors were adopted and they would adopt their heir. So perhaps the most significant adoption in all of Roman history is the adoption of Octavian by Julius Caesar. So Augustus by Julius Caesar. And that gets like broadcast on coins. And what happens is, Julius Caesar adopts Augustus as his son. He's not his son. He's not anyway. But Augustus maintains like his birth family alongside his adoptive family. So like, and this is all over the place. So inscriptions will read like, so-and-so son of so-and-so by birth of so-and-so. So your lineage always is like dual duly documented, because it was, it was a way of bringing honor to the person who was being adopted, and or just celebrating them if they had a lot of wealth, because that's the other thing. This is like a status thing. Wealthy people are doing this. People who have inheritance to pass on are doing this. Slaves aren't doing this. Slaves couldn't do this. Anyway.
No, it's fascinating. It's so fascinating. So you're studying this and figuring this out, and you're in the Christian faith. What does that do for your identity as an adopted person? And I'm kind of making an assumption here, but I'd love a comment on it, is, you've grown up in, the Catholic Church, and now as in a teenagerhood, you are in this faith. And I don't know if it was like this where you were, but adoption is very much celebrated and sort of seen as something that you maybe should do as a good deed, a good act kind of thing, a social justice issue. What does that mean for you, adult Erin, studying these things and unpacking this?
I think this is an area where I've definitely gone through some, hard knocks and deconstruction, because as a teenager, it felt very safe for me. And I didn't grow up in this, so it's not like my parents, and I want to say that really clearly, my parents did not push that narrative with me ever. So I didn't experience like the gospel in my living room language, which I find really kind of horrible and offensive.
Okay, can you say what that is for folks that don't know?
It's a line from a book that I don't recommend anyone who is adopted read, because it's not life-giving, but I've done some work on this. So I've read a lot of Christian resources that talk about adoption, like modern adoption, and then try to give a theological account of it. And a lot of it is like, adoption is beautiful. It's the gospel in my living room. I see, every time I see my adopted child, I recognize, I guess, my own salvation. But that you're making the face that I'm making. It's just not helpful. So my parents did not at all push that narrative. Like, it was very much like, we couldn't have children, so we adopted you from Catholic Charities because our social worker placed you with us, and we feel really lucky that we've been brought together as a family. But like, they have never talked about it in a savior sort of paradigm ever. So I didn't grow up with that. And I think when I kind of first encountered that language as an evangelical, like, there's something at face value, there was something a little bit comforting about it. Like, God had a hand in bringing me to this place in my family. But, that doesn't sit very well for very long. And so especially as I got more into my research, and especially then in some side projects that have taken me into the literature on Christian adoption, and, what passes for theological foundations for it, I just think it's really problematic to equate these things. I think it's really damaging. And so as an adoptee, working with my Pauline text, I'm kind of like, well, this has caused me to ask some really, hard questions about what it means to be adopted, but they're not questions that I necessarily have to engage in my research most of the time, because Paul's just not talking about that. But then it raises, like, if he's not talking about that, and if they're being used in this conversation, what's my responsibility as an adoptee and a scholar to say, wait a minute, this isn't helpful. This isn't right. And it's not life-giving. And you're actually silencing, I think, the most important voice in the conversation, which is the voice of the adoptee. So yeah, there's been some deconstruction for sure. And I'm so aware when I go and speak to Christians on adoption, I only usually get asked like once because it's not happy. Like, I'm not going to give the happy talk, because adoption, like I said, I have a wonderful relationship with my family, but like, it's still born of loss. It's born of trauma, and there's no point in pretending otherwise. It's not helpful for anybody. Certainly not helpful to dress it up in religious language. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
Well, to bring my personal experience into this, which I don't normally do, but I think it will help our conversation. So I was tearing up when you're talking about that, because as a Christian who's kind of going through this, sorry, gross buzzword, the deconstruction, and I listened to a sermon at my home church. I've almost been going there 20 years, Erin. I can't even believe I can say that, but it's true. Every time adoption is brought up, it is always colored with this connection to modern day adoption. And it makes me so uncomfortable, because as I think about, well, am I still going to be here? Like, am I here for having a relationship with God, or am I here for social reasons? Like, why am I here sitting in a pew or at home because coronavirus? But I'm thinking, like, well, why would God really want me ripped out of my roots and put in another family? And what does that mean for the first mother who lost out on raising a child? And what does that mean for all the folks I talk to on a daily basis and their pain and trauma that this has caused? And then I go to the next step, where when I think about the other folks in the room listening to the same conversation that I am, or the same sermon that I am, thinking, oh, yeah, we should really get in on that. And I don't think they read the living room book that you talked about, but the Gospel in the Living Room, cringe. But it again is perpetuating this. And I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent, but I feel like it's the pipeline where you're like, Kate, there's these orphans in the world, or there's foster kids that are aging out and they're coming out homeless. So where's the church in this? We need to show up for these kids. But the pipeline, unfortunately, is, and I went to some of these classes on adoption early on in our marriage. And it was like, oh, yes, we got to save those older kids, adopt from the orphanage, etc. You know the drill. But then they're like, oh, it's so hard, though. It's really, really hard. Are you sure you're up for this? It's so, so hard. What's better is the younger you can get them. It's a lot better. It's easier for your family. It can be more expensive, but you can fundraise. And then you see where it's going, right? So that's hard. Did you look at that from the adoptee perspective when you were sort of deconstructing yourself and unraveling the church narrative with what you've learned in your personal experience?
Yeah, I did. And not just from my personal experience, but my question as an adoptee and as a researcher is, what part is this toxic narrative playing in propping up that pipeline? I mean, and it's a big question. And I have looked at this from a few different angles, and I think adoption is always going to be a complicated topic, right? And I certainly want to see the church step in and support vulnerable families, because that's the first, we need to have that holistic view of this topic. And adoption, unfortunately, kind of short circuits the holistic view of supporting vulnerable families, which is horrifying. And these texts then get propped up, used to be to separate families, which is even more horrifying to me. And every safeguard that's in place to protect vulnerable children, vulnerable families, vulnerable women, in this narrative, in this theological narrative where adoption is an absolute good, and that contemporary adoption, I mean, the thing that always gets said is contemporary adoption is a horizontal expression of God's vertical adoption of us. I'm sure that's not language. If people have been in church, that's probably the language of a sermon, and I think the more that I've sat with that narrative, and that's in, I can name probably, I won't because it's a not recommended resources. But I can, just off the top of my head, I can think of 7 books where that phrase occurs. And I just think, actually, there's no such thing as horizontal adoption. That makes it sound like adoption is some sort of mutually entered into agreement. And that's just not the case. What you end up with is a mini vertical adoption that's actually, when we make mini vertical things that look like what God does in the Bible, it's idolatry. it's not godly, it's idolatry. And I think that's in essence what we end up doing when we, use this adoption narrative to talk about the adoption of children. We are creating little idols for ourselves. And Samuel Perry in this book that is published by OUP, so it's very expensive, he talks about this, like the orphan fetish. And I think that's a good word. Like the children become like an object of special religious significance for adoptive families in the technical sense. And I think that, when you cringe and you say that makes me feel really uncomfortable, it makes you feel icky, I think it's because what's happening to adoptees in churches is that it sounds bad, but like we're becoming these kind of fetishes, like an object of special religious significance. And it doesn't give us space to wrestle. And it doesn't give us the space that we need to be able to say, actually, this traumatized me. I lost things here. It's not reasonable for you to think that I'm going to feel grateful all the time. So yes, I've done some thinking about that.
It's so frustrating to have this conversation with you and completely agree, and yet I am like, well, what do we do about it then? Like, how do you shift the narrative? And you get asked once, you said, to speak, and then they don't want you back. And I honestly feel like when it comes to the church stuff, I'm just literally banging my head on a brick wall, because there's no breaking through that saviorism thing. It's just, and when you describe it as the fetishization, oh boy, yeah, that is cringe.
I know it is cringe, and I know, like, I know it makes people cringe. I'm saying, I think Samuel Perry, when he wrote it, probably knew people were going to cringe. But what I think is so fascinating about his research is that he basically what he demonstrates is that, like, people aren't actually adopting in larger numbers than they were. In fact, adoption has gone down like astronomically. Right? Since I was adopted. What's so frustrating about this Christian adoption language is that basically they're not convincing more people to adopt. They're just giving people a narrative to talk about adoption who were going to adopt anyway. So like no one wins in this. It's really, I find that kind of depressing to think actually, this is the narrative's not helpful for the adoptive family. It's not helpful. It's damaging for the adoptee. It's damaging for, families who have lost children to adoption. And no one's adopting more. So why do we have this? And I think it's unfortunately, it's well-intentioned people who are trying to do well-intentioned things to help vulnerable children who are just terribly, terribly short-sighted. And I don't know how to change the conversation because, as you say, you feel like you're banging your head on a brick wall. I feel like that. And I have some credentials behind my name that make it sound like I should be able to talk intelligently about this. But as soon as you start sharing your story as an adoptee, people get uncomfortable. It makes people uncomfortable. And so then it's like, well, we're comfortable. Like the language that I often then it's like, well, we're comfortable doing this. We're comfortable with our safe narrative. That's more comfortable. So I don't know what it takes to change. I mean, my go-to is always like, well, I'll publish a book, but people then have to read the book. And well, first I have to write the book and then people have to read the book. I don't know how this shifts. It's like a big machine and you just feel like you're one. I often feel like there's like one or two of us saying, please stop. And the machine just keeps going. I know that's not very uplifting.
No, but I get it. I get it. And, you were talking about family preservation and supporting the vulnerable family unit, the vulnerable mother. And, we always hear the widows and orphans in James. And it's very much when we talk about that, we talk about them like the widows, and the orphans, but it's really meant as a unit. Isn't that right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely a unit. All the way, in James, and James stands in a long line of Old Testament prophets. And it's always a unit. Widows and orphans are vulnerable because they've lost it's patriarchal society. they've lost their male protector. So it's your job, community, to protect these vulnerable families who are missing a male protector.
So it's like coming alongside the struggling family unit is ideal, in my opinion. And, but that's not the sexy saviorism example.
No.
Right?
I mean, it's the biblical example. That's what you see in the Bible. It is. Yeah, I know. I mean, but like, I'm a Christian, so I'm perfectly happy to say that the Bible has a normative function in my life. If we see the normative function be not super sexy and not saviorism, which arguably is the Christian life in its totality, why would it surprise us that like caring for vulnerable families does not make us look like saviors? Like, that's just not the goal. We have one savior. We don't need mini saviors all over the place. So no, it's not sexy, but none of the Christian life is supposed to be sexy.
Well, okay. So Lynn, let me go at this another way. I remember, I don't know if this was outright taught or not, but absorbing this message that the Christian life is not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be challenging. And so there was this kind of thought that if things were difficult and it was like this uphill battle, then you knew you were on the right track, like the narrow way. And when you talk about adoption with adoptive parents in particular, right, there's a huge monetary hill to climb, you know. There's all the home studies, all the hoops and paperwork and things to jump and lawyers and, you know, all of those things. And so it does become this like barrier and you're overclimbing. And that's sort of the language I see when people considering adoption or blogging about it perhaps or sharing on social for fundraising purposes. And so I think that's wrapped in it too.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think that's helpful. I mean, some things are difficult. One, I mean... Again, there's like all of this lament that it's so difficult to adopt a child. You know, why is it so difficult? And I'm like, because it should be. Like it should be. This is not a. But I think it just because something's difficult doesn't mean that it's right. You know, some things are difficult because they're not. It's not a clear-cut moral issue. So I think it's really problematic to say that just because something's hard means that, you know, God's hand must be in it. Sometimes things, you know, sometimes when you're climbing uphill and it's hard, God's hand's not in it. And how do we know that? I think that's where like community discernment comes from. But then you have to listen to all the voices. And we don't have all the voices in the conversation right now. So, yeah, I think you're right, though. There's this spiritualizing of the difficulty of adoption. And I think that's not helpful. And I don't see other than in a very general sense, like it doesn't say that every time you encounter any difficulty ever, it's because you're following God's path. Like that's not realistic.
Okay. I think my last like little thing towards this is thinking of the young people who may get asked to share. So the young adopted person, so I'm thinking of teen to young 20s. And if you're in evangelical circles, you've probably heard of like Orphan Sunday. And there's this, I wish you guys could see Erin's face. And so young people who have been adopted, especially from other countries, so transracially or transnationally or a combo of both, will often be sort of asked to share their experience and like how thankful and grateful they are. And, you know, it makes me uncomfortable even just saying those things, but I'm telling you that happens. You know it does. Okay. And
in promotional videos.
Yes, in the promotional videos. And I would love for us to consider the safety of that. person. So they are being asked to participate in this, and they're still a young person who cannot necessarily, leave home supported, pay for their education, all those things, right? They are still living in likely under the umbrella of their adoptive parent's safety. And so how can they really speak truthfully about their experience or have processed their experience?
Yeah, I mean, I just think we shouldn't be asking people to do that.
I know, and I'm not asking you to defend it. I'm like, be on my team, Erin. You are.
No,
tell me about it.
I am on your team. Yeah, if you are a church leader and you are listening to this, please. I hope church leaders are listening to the podcast with adoptees on them, but please don't do that. Because I think, and they might feel like they're speaking truthfully, but boy, adoption is such a personal journey that like what you say as a teenager, you should be allowed to say as a teenager, wherever you are, but you should not be held to it, or it should not be used to promote adoption more widely. Because first of all, you're a teenager, you might have really different feelings, and that, that's an intensely vulnerable story to be sharing. I think it's just exploitative to have young people put in that position. So it just, in my view, it just shouldn't happen. How can they do that safely? I don't think they can do it. I mean, it's one of those things that might feel safe in the time, and then in hindsight, it might feel really unsafe. Mm-hmm. And I think we should always err on the side of, not putting people in those positions where they are, talking about these really vulnerable things as if they're speaking on behalf of a community, or that their story has somehow more spiritual significance than like another kid in the youth group who wouldn't be, put on a pamphlet. Do you know what I mean? But that's the thing. Like, it's not safe because of what it's going to go do. I think teenagers should be able to share in their communities of faith, for sure. And they should be able to share their stories freely. What they shouldn't have done is their story exploited for some larger purpose. Mm-hmm. And I think adoptees are a lot more at risk than that. And quite frankly, they've been through some things that just take years to process, and so should be treated, I think, with a lot more caution and a lot more care than they usually are. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I do agree that it takes years to process. So when I see those kinds of things happening, I'm always like, okay, talk to me in 10 years, talk to me in 15 years. It took me long enough, to unravel things, I'm sure.
Yeah. Adoptive parents, just don't put your kids in that position. Let their story be their story, as teenagers, and don't feel the need to overshare it because it's just not helpful.
Yes. I will say amen to that for sure. I have this line written down from your essay in Making Sense of Motherhood. And it talks about, okay, how do I say this here? Belonging comes at the expense of displacement. And you're talking about adoption. Can you unpack that a little bit and, just share what that line means to you? Belonging comes at the expense of displacement.
Yeah. So a little background on that essay. I'm a mother. I have 2 children. They were both born in New Zealand, and they were both born when I was writing my PhD thesis. Maybe not something I recommend doing. But it was, if you want to think about things that test your sense of self, motherhood, PhD thesis, and then as an adoptee, writing a PhD thesis on adoption while you're giving birth, it was just a lot.
That's an understatement. I'm pretty sure it was a lot.
It was just a lot. So this essay, I got asked to write. The story of that's kind of strange too. I got asked to write something because I happened to sit next to somebody on a bus who was like, "We're writing a book on motherhood. What do you do?" And I was like, "Well, I work on adoption." "Oh, would you like to contribute something to our book on motherhood?" And I was like, "You know that adoption has nothing to do with motherhood in the New Testament." "Well, that doesn't matter. Maybe you have something to say." So Ruth Sheridan, if you're listening, this essay is your Anyway, so I wrote this essay right after I finished my PhD thesis and submitted. And I would just moved back to my parents' house. My son was like 5 weeks old because he was born 2.5 weeks past his due date, which is not pleasant in its own right. Anyway,
Wow.
So I'm working on this essay because I have this publishing grant and I have to, and like I have the contract and I have to write this. And I thought to myself, like, I can write this as kind of a dispassionate observer, but it's not going to be an honest reflection of my own kind of journey with this text in Paul, and it's on Romans 8. So what I'm trying to do in this essay is to say, like, what does it mean for me as an adopted person, and especially now as a mother, to read this text on adoption, a very different kind of adoption, but on adoption. And yeah, I have these sections, and, you know, like in the New Testament, there is displacement in Romans 8. And I'm kind of advocating this, like, not nice, neat, clean reading of Romans 8. Like the Christian who's adopted in Romans 8 is groaning and is suffering and is called to suffer. But I think there's like not enough recognition of that displacement in that text. And so the more that I've sat with that text, the more I do see some of my story mirrored in it, but not, it's almost like my way of reclaiming it from the neat, clean narrative of those adoption resources. And when I say that belonging comes at the expense of displacement, really what I'm thinking of as an adoptee is just like this zero-sum system has, I mean, there's incalculable loss for an adoptee in that. And we need to come to a place, as, you know, if we're using these texts in places of faith in churches, then we need a place for an adoptee to say, I have suffered incalculable loss. I have suffered displacement as a result of my adoption. And I might feel like I belong now. I might not. And we need space to be able to say that. And so I guess my attempt in that essay was to just give voice to some of that feeling of displacement, that feeling of being, you know, neither here nor there. You belong to both families, but you don't, in some sense, you feel like you don't belong to either family. And you're always just caught. And in Romans 8, I think there is that sense of caughtness, but I think I catch it. That's kind of a bad pun, and I didn't mean to. But, you know, I think I get that more as an adoptee than someone who's never experienced that kind of displacement. Mm-hmm. So,
well, your essay is so, I think I don't know if this is the right word, Erin, but I feel like it's very gentle to both first parents, first mothers, and adoptive mothers. I think that you treat them both with a real grace, and there's this, like, for me, it's in the constellation, there is a lot of, you know, back and forth and infighting, and, well, our perspectives, right? Yours, you know, all that stuff. But I really feel that you've done just a really beautiful job at examining all of those different points of view and unpacked it really, really beautifully.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Spoiler. Guess who I'm going to recommend. Anyway, I won't say anything more about it right now. But I just think there's so much wisdom in here. And I was so excited to talk to you about this essay. And we didn't get to too much of it, but I think you've really unpacked a lot of it for us already. There's another line in here. Perhaps the best course of action is to resist drawing parallels between the biblical text and contemporary adoption narratives altogether.
Yep. That's my gentle way of saying we should not be doing this.
We should not be.
We just shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, total. I mean, you know, that's it. End scene. Well, before we do recommended resources, is there any general message that you want to give to other adopted people that maybe like you and I have wrestled with these things and had some pain associated with it, like I'm still experiencing?
Yeah, I think obviously my story is just that. It's my story. And I would never want to presume to speak to someone, you know, to give advice to somebody in their own story, in their own journey. if you are, adopted and you are traumatized by this narrative, I just want you to, I want adoptees to know that, I see you. I see that. And that's real. And that it's not right that people don't listen to you, because your perspective is important. It's the only thing that's going to heal the church, I think. So I don't know what to say. It's not really advice, but just to say, yeah, I see you and your perspective is important, and you're not alone.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I do want to recommend your essay. It's called The Inward Groaning of Adoption, and it's based on Romans 8, verses 12 to 25, recovering the Pauline adoption metaphor for mothers in the adoption triad. And it's, I'll link to this in the show notes so you don't have to remember. It's in the book called Making Sense of Motherhood, Biblical and Theological Perspectives. I also read your academic book, which is your thesis, right, for your PhD.
Yeah.
And Adoption in Galatians and Romans, Contemporary Metaphor Theories, and the Pauline,
Huiothesia.
Thank you, metaphors. And so though you do teach some of the things that we kind of talked about today, a lot of those are in your essay as well, you're also diving into some really complicated New Testament things. And it can be a challenging read. So
that's fair. Yeah, it is a PhD. Yeah, it's a PhD thesis. They're not known for their, I guess, page turning quality.
No, but I can cite it.
There is. I did manage to work in because it's on metaphor theory too. So how we think about language and how metaphors work and whatever. So there is, there's a lighthearted section on flying monkeys.
Puns?
Yeah, in one of the chapters that I feel very proud to have put in an academic book. So
and
all things to look forward to, I guess.
Yes. And I don't write in books, but I did underline in your book. So I write in all of my books. Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a very high compliment. So anyway.
Yeah. Thank you.
I appreciate your work so much. And, we were kind of talking before we started recording how some of the books in academia are just out of reach for a lot of folks just because of the cost. And there's reasons for that. You guys, I don't even know. So don't email us if you're looking up the books that we're about to talk about and be like, Haley, why? So I understand it's not always affordable. So what do you want to recommend to us, Erin?
Oh my gosh. So I guess my caveat is that this is a book that has really helped me think about the phenomenon of the adoption narrative in evangelical circles in the United States. So it's by Samuel Perry, and I believe it's called Growing God's Family. And it's really good. It's just that it's published by Oxford University Press. So, get your library to get a copy of it, because what he's doing is looking at this. I mean, I think he was a person of faith at one point. I'm not sure if he still is, but that's not really the point of the book. What he's trying to do is look at the phenomenon of adoption and look at how things like Orphan Sunday, things like Christian Alliance for Orphans, what impact are those having on whether or not families adopt and whether or not, So I recommend that just because it's a good, sometimes I think we can get so kind of frustrated with the state of the conversation that I feel like I can lose my perspective. And that's a book where I think actually there is some hard data here, if you will, where I can grab onto this and say, look, I can show you why this isn't helpful. Even if you don't think my perspective as an adoptee is important or helpful in informing the conversation, which I hope you do, but maybe you don't. But then I can actually point to his, Samuel Perry's work and say, look, this isn't even having the effect that you want it to have. So maybe we should go a different way, go a different way together. It'll be more life-giving for everybody. So I would highly recommend that. It's an impeccably researched book. It's actually not, it's an academic book, but it's not some academic books are offensively boring. This one is not. So I've never met Samuel Perry, so I'm not anyway. Yeah. So if you're listening to this, I think your book is not offensively boring. I thought it was really interesting. So.
I'm so excited. I'm totally gonna. Well, first I'll look at the price and then I'll see if I can order it. But
it's not as expensive as Brill, so that's already a step in the right direction.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Well, I so enjoyed this conversation. Erin has promised me with a little star. She's not on socials, you guys. What a lucky lady. But if you do have some questions,
it's self-preservation, Haley.
You're so wise. Like, can you tell? On Facebook, I always have a little post of the current podcast. So if you do have questions for Dr. Heim, you can post them there and she'll get to some of them when she has a chance. And yeah, so that's the best way to connect with her. And also, I wanted to tell you that you have a podcast yourself and there is a very specific niche. It is called On Script, which I love because my Patreon show is called Adoptees Off Script. So very different conversations happening. So you can also listen to her on Script. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, our podcast, I co-host it with some friends. We're all academics and we work in various institutions in the United States and Canada and the UK. And basically what we do is we have people on who are publishing in biblical studies and theology, and we talk to them about their work. But I do have an episode on there from like a long time ago where Drew Johnson, my friend from the King's College in New York, interviewed me on my book. So if you want like the Cliff's Notes version on adoption in Galatians and Romans, that's slightly longer than what we just talked about and is slightly nerdier than what we just did. You can check out that episode of On Script instead of buying the ridiculously expensive book.
Well,
I'm sorry for that.
I have listened to that episode a couple of times. It's from 2017, I think. And the fellow interviewing you is an adoptive parent. And so sometimes when he's asking you questions, I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm just like bracing but you answer so like eloquently and like unpack things that are, again, it's emotional labor that's not required, but we're thankful for it. And so, yeah, I my second thumbs up, not that you needed it, but to that episode of your show. Great. Thank you so much. This was such a delight to talk with you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Did you learn something today? I hope so. I certainly did. I'm really grateful for Erin and for others like her who have the willingness to stand up and speak up. And even if you only get the invite one time, to tell the truth about adoption. And as hard as this is like the fifth time I've tried to record this. So you know what? We're just gonna stick with me. As hard as committing to actually doing a series on spirituality has been, I've actually talked about it for a number of years. And I'm finally like, okay, let's do it. Because I don't want to offend anybody. I want you to still feel included. And I know I'm going to miss someone's personal experience and say the wrong thing at some point. But because of our adoptions being so personal and deeply wounding and all of those things, just so our faith journey or lack thereof or spiritual journey or disinterest in spirituality, all of those things are also so deeply personal. And I think when they're intertwined, it's so interesting to look at, even if it's painful or challenging or pushes us out of our comfort zone. So I hope you get where I'm kind of going with that and why I keep talking about this and like, sorry if I offend you like that. If you get that sense from me, that's why. But for me personally, the interlink with Christianity, evangelicalism, and the adoption promotion machine is such an ugly mix that's why it was important for me to bring that to you today. So I promise I will treat each episode with the highest sensitivity I can. And I understand when there are episodes that you're like, oh, this is not, this is either triggering for me or this is like so way out there. It is just not for me. Like, I respect that. Like, listen to what you want to. And I hope that as you listen outside your comfort zone, that even if you disagree, that you will still take away, hopefully from some place of empathy for like, oh, okay, that's not for me, but I get why they are doing that, or, that kind of a thing. Anyway, I'm done. I appreciate you being here. I'm only here because of my amazingly generous Patreon supporters, and you will keep hearing some notes from them as we carry on through this fall season. They're inviting you to join them. And if you go to adopteeson.com/partner, you can find out details of how to join them and get the extra bonuses like a book club and our off-script parties. And if you want your voice on the podcast, I am looking right now for recordings for Adoptee Remembrance Day. If you go to adopteeson.com/ARD for Adoptee Remembrance Day, and you can send me your thoughts on loss and adoption trauma and your experience as an adoptee. And I'm putting that episode together to acknowledge Adoptee Remembrance Day, which is October 30th. And if you have those recordings to me by October 20th, that would be very helpful. So thank you so much for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.